All right, I know we are still getting some food back there, but we're going to get started because we have a limited amount of time, and I want to hear from our wonderful speakers. So welcome, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here to introduce not only our inaugural Senior Fellow in Residence, Brittny Saunders, but the newest initiative of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy. So this fall, we're welcoming three dynamic individuals: a practitioner, that's Brittny, a law professor, Zephyr Teachout, and an urban planning professor who focuses on gentrification, Lance Freeman. Each of the senior fellows brings something unique to our BC community. They'll all be delivering a community address, teaching a seminar, and meeting with members of our community. Over the course of the semester, I hope you'll avail yourselves of multiple opportunities to engage with our fellows. It's a program we're really excited about, and so please take the opportunity to meet our fellows and hear from them. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Brittny Saunders. Brittny is the Deputy Commissioner for Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. There, she manages interagency partnerships and special projects working on racial justice issues and data-driven discrimination. Prior to joining the commission, Brittny worked for the office of the mayor, most recently as acting counsel to Mayor Bill de Blasio. Brittny has worked to ensure broadband equity throughout the 5 boroughs of New York. She has crafted legislation to bar discrimination on the basis of credit and criminal history in the employment context, and she's helped codify the Commission on Gender Equity. Before entering state government, Brittny worked for the Center for Popular Democracy, where she was supervising attorney for the immigrant rights and racial justice. She's a graduate of Harvard University, both undergrad and the law school. As a perfect follow-up from the Rappaport Center opening program on race and public policy, today, Brittny will be sharing her talk entitled Building Infrastructure for Equity, Challenging Racism Through Work in Local Government. So please join me in welcoming Brittny Saunders.
First of all, thank you everyone for joining me this afternoon. I am incredibly excited to have been named a member of the inaugural class of Senior Fellows in Residence at the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy here at BC. And I want to say a special word of thanks, of course, to Dean Rougeau, to Dan Canstrom and Lizzie Medvedev, and Cindy Nguyen, who've all helped to make me feel welcome here now that I've arrived. And also special thanks to my friend Dan Farbman. And so I guess I'd just like to start by saying that I think the need for thoughtful reflection on and discussion of public policy has never been greater than it is now. And it's truly an honor for me to offer some kind of opening thoughts in that direction with you this afternoon. So I believe that our current times, they really call on us to be clear about our values. So what are the principles that govern the way that we govern, those of us who work in public policy? And what does it mean to fully inhabit those values? These are questions that can sometimes seem very abstract, but they're really thrown into sharp relief when shared norms start to fall away, which is a lot of what we're seeing now. In my opinion, the current context also compels us to really try to reckon with our past, even as we're trying to adapt to and to develop solutions around new complex challenges that are changing the way that we interact with each other, the functioning of our economy, as well as the way that we all interact with government. And I also think that these times have personally really forced me to reflect on my own relationship to power. So what has it been? How has it changed? And what are the responsibilities that come with it when you're working in a government capacity? But I'm going to focus my address today through how I've come to these conclusions through my own work, first as an advocate, and then as a practitioner of public policy and local government, since I think it's helpful for you to know a little bit about who I am and where I'm coming from. And I've made my best effort to anchor my thoughts in these three concepts, right? These three notions of values, a willingness to engage honestly with our past and the lessons that it has to teach us, and a continuous evaluation of one's own relationship to power. But I'll start with a little bit of personal background, because for me, identity is an important part of why I do the work that I do. So I'm a Black woman. I'm also an immigrant. My family moved from Jamaica in the early 1980s, And to be more precise about the process that allowed that to happen, my grandmother moved to the U.S., actually to Dorchester, in the 1970s. And then when she became a citizen, petitioned to have many of her family members join us. So that included my father first, who migrated to the U.S. In around 1984, and then my mother, my sister, and myself, who joined him a few years later. And so there's a new term that some folks are trying to popularize to discuss this sort of migration. I'm not going to repeat it because I prefer the term family unification, because that's what it was for my family, and that's what it is and has been for countless others. It's also an illustration of how thoughtful policies that are really grounded in a sense of humanity can have really powerful impacts that echo across time. So I don't know any of the policymakers or the advocates who worked on the immigration reforms that allowed my family to come to this country, but I am grateful for them every day. And I like to imagine that the work that I do now in government will hopefully have similar effects for other folks down the road. But my family eventually moved from Boston to New York City area when I was in kindergarten. I had the good fortune to attend some really fabulous public schools. I was fortunate to get a solid academic grounding in those schools, but I also learned other lessons as well. So I attended a really racially diverse elementary school with roughly equal numbers of Black students, Latinx students, Asian American students, and white students. I attended a magnet public middle school that was largely Black and Latinx. And then I attended a public high school where I could count the number of other Black students on my two hands. So I had these really diverse experiences. And in high school, I'll say it was a particular type of education. So I had great opportunities for leadership. I met friends that I treasure to this day. But I also had some of the types of interactions and encountered some of the sorts of racial aggressions that are actually pretty common among a lot of Black folks. So I had the experience of people making comments about my hair. I had the experience of people questioning my intelligence, and they were upsetting, but they were also somewhat normalized, to tell the truth, because the messages that I was hearing from some of my peers also just kind of echoed messages that we had all internalized as young people about this nation's racial hierarchy. But I'm going to take the liberty here of fast-forwarding through all of my high school experiences, including an inordinate amount of time spent watching C-SPAN, which I'm happy to talk to you about later. I don't know if anyone here, actually I'm glad you laughed, because I was afraid people wouldn't even know what C-SPAN was. But I'll tell you a little bit about the upshot of all of this, which is that by the time I got to college, I was someone who was really deeply interested in questions of race and racism. And by the time I got to law school, I was pretty clear that I wanted to use my legal training to develop some advocacy skills and some analytical skills that I could bring to a fight, or the fight, to challenge racial injustice in this country. So from all of this came this commitment to the values of inclusion, of equity, of justice, that have really informed my work since graduating from law school. And while I was in law school itself, I explored a lot of different paths. So I worked for the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, a small environmental racism organization in California. I worked at the ACLU Racial Justice Project. I interned at Deval Patrick's, in the Office of the Governor's Legal Counsel under Deval Patrick in the earliest days of his administration. And as graduation approached, though, I wasn't 100% sure of where I would land because I had all this experience and I had some kind of instincts and intuitions that I'd developed through them, but it wasn't kind of clear to me what model of lawyering I was going to pursue and how this was going to amount to, a kind of clear, recognizable career path. But I did have a sense that I wanted to work in public policy because I thought it would afford me the kind of impact and the kind of breadth of audience that other strategies I was considering might not have offered. By spring of 2009, I had been fortunate to land at an organization called the Center for Social Inclusion, which is now called Race Forward, which at the time was one of a relatively small number of national policy shops that was focused on developing policy proposals that were geared towards addressing racial inequity. And it was grounded in a pretty clear theory of change, which was that government and the policies that it had churned out over the years and the policies that it had enforced over time had served as a really powerful driver of structural racism. But then on the flip side, because of that, thoughtful policies that were drafted and implemented with the kind of impact of historical racial oppression in mind could have the impact of trying to reverse some of those impacts. So my work at the time involved advocacy to influence the structure of programs to distribute broadband and transportation funding, all of this being part of the 2009 stimulus bill. It also involved partnering with community-based organizations, largely in southern states actually, to develop proposals that might be able to secure that funding. So this gave me my first opportunity to try to translate my commitment to racial justice into concrete work. And in this case, that meant trying to direct federal funding or structure programs so that federal funding was more likely to flow to communities of color that had long been starved for such investment. And it instilled in me also a belief that I continue to hold dear, even as my roles have changed, which is that the best public policy is policy that is developed in partnership with individuals and communities that are impacted by the issues in question. So after a bunch of really rewarding years at CSI, I left in 2012. And I joined the staff of an organization called the Center for Popular Democracy. I think I was maybe the 5th staff member for the organization, which is now much, much larger. But their whole focus was on organizing and advocacy for progressive policies that was focused on the local and state government. Based, again, on this theory that there was a tremendous amount that could be done to advance racial justice, economic justice, and immigrant rights by focusing on the levels of government that were closest to impacted people. And I had the tremendous honor while there of partnering with other advocates to advance a pilot program to provide deportation defense for individuals who were detained, also creating new mechanisms for accountability for local law enforcement as well. And the experience of doing this work in the community where I lived and seeing it benefit my neighbors deepened my commitment to continuing in racial justice advocacy. In 2014, though, I got the opportunity to take these skills and take this commitment and try to apply it in a very different context, that being, of course, the local government context. So my former boss at CSI had accepted a position as the counsel to the newly elected mayor of the city of New York, and she invited me to come on board as her deputy. Truthfully, I had some qualms. Some of them were about work-life balance, because at this point I had one young child, and I was worried, rightfully so as it turned out, that working in the mayor's office would require being on call a lot more often. But I also had larger questions that kind of loomed about whether I would really be able to have impact. I felt like when I was working at CPD, I was starting to see my work and my advocacy bear fruit. And the question was whether I would be able to see, or at least contribute to, the change that I wanted to see. And again, it's this idea of trying to reorient the machinery of government to kind of support and advance racial justice goals, whether it was actually possible. But ultimately, I ended up taking that leap, largely because I knew that if I didn't, I would have questions in my mind. I would always wonder, what might have happened and what could I have done with that opportunity. So I left CPD. I began working at the mayor's office, and during that time, I received an education at a really breakneck pace on how government works. I developed strategies around how to expand broadband access in the city of New York. There were a number of amendments to the city's human rights law that came through at that time, because a new progressive city council had been elected, and so there was a lot of negotiation around new protections related to criminal history and credit history and employment, among other topics. And then I even had the opportunity to serve, as the dean mentioned, as acting counsel to the mayor during the summer of 2016. But ultimately, shortly before the election in 2016, I actually ended up moving to the Commission on Human Rights, which enforces and educates New Yorkers about our city human rights law, which is actually among the most robust and protective municipal human rights laws in the country. And my work at the Commission has allowed me to continue to fight for racial justice from this seat in government. And yes, some obvious facts deserve to be stated up front. So one is that we are among the smallest of New York City's municipal agencies. And we also do not, as many of our large sister agencies do, administer multi-billion-dollar education programs or public benefit programs or housing programs. But we do have a leading role to play in the enforcement of human rights protections in the city related to employment, housing, public accommodations, discriminatory harassment, which is almost like a civil version of a hate crime, and then bias-based profiling by police, by law enforcement agencies, which is actually one of the protections that I helped to get enacted back when I was an advocate. So it's really been kind of cool to see that work come full circle. So yes, so we don't have necessarily a particularly huge budget, but we do have power, and we've been able to use that power to take some important steps. So in February, one of the things that we did was to release a new legal enforcement guidance document, which clarified for employers and for providers of public accommodations that discrimination, or rather grooming policies that prohibit individuals from wearing their hair in styles or textures that are typically associated with Black people or Black culture falls within the realm of race-based discrimination as we interpret it at the Commission. And so I could not have anticipated how this would be received, but ultimately it was picked up and carried by broadcast and print media around this country and across the world. And it also ended up inspiring similar measures at the state level in California, in New York State, and then also in New Jersey. And I'll say that one of the most personally rewarding moments for me related to this work was just being able to scroll through social media and see some of the responses from people in New York and in other parts of the country and other parts of the world as well, talking about their own experiences with this form of discrimination and the impact that they hoped that the guidance would have. Over much of 2018 and 2019, we also partnered on a project that really attempted to use arts as a vehicle for communicating around human rights protections in the city of New York. So we partnered with an artist named Tatiana Fazlalizadeh. Does anyone know who that is? That's all right, that's all right. So she is, and has anyone ever seen the Netflix series, She's Gotta Have It, the Spike Lee series? So she's the artist who produces all the work for that series and kind of the inspiration for the Nola Darling character, or at least as it's interpreted in this iteration of the work. But Tatiana worked with us to convene conversations with folks across the city of New York around their experiences with anti-Black discrimination and also gender-based street harassment. And then she translated those into a series of murals that were installed across the 5 boroughs. We've got them in Harlem, in Bed-Stuy, in Jamaica, Queens, and in the South Bronx as well. And so it's actually been some of the work that has brought new folks into awareness about the Commission, folks who might not typically even be aware of the work that we do. And following that project, or actually in tandem with that project, in the spring of 2019, we also ran a campaign that ran in subways, on bus shelters, and on social media across the city of New York, which was titled While Black. And so the inspiration for that campaign were the stories that we had seen, and I'm sure many folks in this room have seen, about people who had had the experience of being targeted while engaged in just mundane day-to-day activities. So the kind of 5 scenarios that are highlighted in the campaign are walking while Black, driving while Black, working, renting, and shopping while Black. And the goal of the campaign was both to affirm those experiences, but then also to communicate that that was a sort of, that targeting on the basis of race and that sort of targeting was something that was of concern for the Commission. And also, we hope that it plays a little bit of a deterrent function and also kind of communicates the city's values around those issues. We've also done some work more recently to try to communicate about the work that we've done in this space to other local government leaders in hopes that it might serve as models for folks. So we've done that through networks like the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, which is a network of, I think, maybe 150 different jurisdictions, largely folks who serve in local government and the kind of executive function. We're really committed to trying to view their work through a racial equity lens and trying to adjust their practice to keep all that in mind and work towards racial equity goals. My work also, as I mentioned earlier, has prompted me to reflect on my own relationship to power. So working for the change that I want to see means becoming more comfortable actually exercising power, even as we at the commission kind of strive to develop new ways of doing so. So approaches that are kind of break with the oppressive and the exclusive exercise of power that we've seen in the past. So it means becoming more comfortable with that exercise, which has been a process for me, which I think has something to do with my identity. So the messages that I internalized early about who is kind of empowered to lead and expected to lead. But I think also kind of is a necessary transition from being in an advocacy role outside of government to then moving into government and having the, both the power and the accountability that comes with it. And I think, you know, we're very proud of the work that we've done. I'm very proud of the work that I've been able to do, but I also want to be 100% clear that there is a lot more work to be done. And even the work that we have done at the commission is kind of a small opening, beginning slice of what needs to happen. So fighting racism, particularly in its structural forms, is going to require years of concerted effort, experimentation and adjustment. It's going to require scrutiny of mundane policy questions and budget priorities. And it's not going to be comfortable work because it necessarily requires partnerships with communities that have been most impacted by structural oppression and folks who have very little reason, frankly, even under the best of circumstances, to trust government. And so it means doing the work, earning trust, and constantly kind of repeating that process so that you can partner with folks to kind of put the smartest types of policies in place. But I do remain convinced that the power of government, particularly local government, can be harnessed in the service of racial justice goals. And that's the commitment that sustains me, and it's the commitment that brought me here to be with you all this week. And I look forward to many rich conversations about this over the next few days. And I just want to thank you for allowing me to share some opening thoughts with you about this afternoon. So thank you. So I am more than happy to answer questions from folks. We've got a good amount of time, I think, for that. I see a hand back there.
As somebody who's in the government now, how do you handle it when it is the government, kind of like that you're fighting against, or that's the person restricting the rights of the people is that government? Mm-hmm. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, we spend a huge amount of time trying to answer that question. As you can imagine, like, we all see kind of the headlines that filter in every day. And for us, those, you know, hit on all our categories of protection or our areas of jurisdiction constantly. So we're always trying to evaluate that. I think part of it is, one, trying to send the message that we approach things very differently within the city of New York, and trying to be clear with folks about where, you know, despite this action that might be taken at the federal level or this threat that is issued from the federal level, you need to understand that you still have these protections within the 5 boroughs. One of the things that makes, it's hard, but one of the things that makes that easier is that at the commission we've made a really concerted effort to have folks on board who have close relationships with various communities across the city. Often those are communities that have had challenging relationships with government or no relationship with government in the past. And so to kind of build that trust as well as those channels so that when there are kind of dramatic policy shifts on the federal level, right, or if people feel threatened because they are threatened, we have channels that we can work in order to communicate with folks or for folks to communicate with us. And we hope that that allows folks to distinguish between us and you know, federal government actors who might be pushing in a very different direction.
Can I follow up on that? It strikes me that one of the difficulties, especially in a big city like yours or ours, in addressing structural racism, is the police force, right? Because of longstanding habits of thought, implicit biases, explicit racism, that's really hard to to ferret out and excise from the organization. So have you seen things either in New York or elsewhere that work to address those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, that is probably so I would say when I talk about challenging relationships that folks have with government, that is one of the key areas where we've seen it, where people talk to us about the challenges that they face. I mean, we have
Can you give some examples? You talked before about, having to gain the trust of, the community. Do you have some examples of what you've done to gain that trust?
That's a great point. I mentioned a little bit about the role of staffing in that. So one is that we bring staff on board who often have worked as advocates in communities in question, or who are part of those communities, in their kind of personal or private lives. And so we, for example, created liaisons, right? So we have a liaison who works with Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities in the city. We have a liaison, it's the first, I think, in city government, who works with African communities across the city of New York. We have other liaisons that help us connect with people of transgender experience in New York City. So I think that has the impact of, one, giving us really valuable expertise, connections. I think another step that we have taken is that we've dramatically increased the number of languages that are spoken at the commission, so that if you are calling to report an experience with discrimination, or you're showing up to a meeting, we will make sure that we have someone there who speaks the language that you speak, or that we think is likely to be spoken in the community. So when, I think in 2015, there was something like 6 languages spoken at the commission, and now it's like 35. So that's been a real area of investment. And then over and above the question of personnel is also programming. So we try to, one, hold a lot of roundtables where we just invite leaders from various communities in, or representatives from various community organizations, try to understand what their current priorities are, and then use that to direct our programming so that it is responsive to our sense of what folks need. And a lot of that is kind of like, sometimes it will be, there's been a pretty sharp rise in bias incidents, right? So sometimes it will be a town hall about bias incidents and what resources are available at the commission and at other city agencies to help folks in communities that are impacted. But sometimes it is just kind of basic know your rights trainings or know your obligations trainings that we offer pretty consistently across the year and across the city, just to kind of get out there and make connections. Because unsurprisingly, there are a lot of people that don't know what the commission is, or what it does, or that it exists. Thank you. No problem. Because we were a little bit more active and had some areas of jurisdiction that they don't have. So for example, I mentioned discriminatory harassment, which is essentially if you've been targeted for harassment, intimidation, in some cases violence, on the basis of your membership in one of our protected categories, and that harassment or intimidation has the impact of limiting your ability to exercise your constitutional or statutory rights, then you may have a claim of discriminatory harassment. That's not something that exists at the state level. So we had, when there were incidents happening early in 2016 and 2017, sometimes folks would report them to the state, and the ones that occurred in the city of New York would get referred to us because we actually had the jurisdiction to handle them. But we actually have, I think, a pretty solid working relationship with a lot of legislative folks in Albany now. There's been some pretty dramatic change over the course since the last election in terms of New York State Senate and the Assembly. And so there are a lot of folks who are really energized and invigorated to institute some of the protections that we have at the local level, at the state level. So that hasn't been so much of a source of tension for us, but there are lots of other ones that operate.
So I know you work in the field of data-driven discrimination.
Yeah.
Could you talk to us a little bit about what kind of data is collected, and then how is that data used in either regulatory or enforcement schemes?
Sure. So we use the term data-driven discrimination at the commission to basically describe questions or instances of discrimination that arise from the use of algorithms. Do folks have kind of a rough sense of what algorithms are? Essentially, formulas are used to increasingly to aid in decision-making, and often in the areas of our jurisdiction, so things like housing, employment, and public accommodations. So you can use the example of employers who are using algorithms to help them sort through large numbers of applicants and to identify who might be the best candidates, who they should invite in for interviews, or housing providers who might be using tenant selection tools to help them identify who they want to, extend an offer to. But as you might imagine, right, it's very easy for these new technologies to just kind of replicate patterns of discrimination that we've seen over time, particularly when a lot of these algorithms are trained using data that's historical data, right, that of course reflects and has baked into it, years of discrimination in those areas, right? So on the private side, what that means is that we are, doing research and trying to understand how those tools operate, how they are designed, with an eye to thinking about what recommendations we can make to folks who are developing or marketing these tools around how they can do so in a way that's consistent with the protections of the human rights law, right? So if you're developing a algorithmic tool that you're going to use in the employment context, and you're looking exclusively at federal protections, right? You might miss some of the areas of protection that we have under our law. So for example, we have protections for individuals, or we have protections that are supposed to protect folks from discrimination on the basis of arrest or criminal history, which is not something that exists at the federal level. So if you, are drawing in records that might allow folks to discern whether someone has been arrested or whether someone has a conviction, and you're using that inappropriately in your candidate selection tool, you could actually run afoul of our law. So we've taken the tack so far, kind of largely focused on research, trying to figure out what affirmative recommendations we can make to folks on the private side. On the public side, I am also co-chair of the city's Automated Decision Systems Task Force, which is a task force that was created in 2018 in order to develop a set of recommendations for how the city itself should approach the use of algorithms in its decision-making, right? So there are kind of widely public. The city created this task force to develop a set of recommendations for how to ensure equity and transparency and accountability in its decision-making around those. Over here.
Speaking of algorithms, one of which was brought up about the number of people of color that are stopped by the police in an inordinate manner. What specifically has the mayor in your office done to address the problems facing people of color in New York?
Cool. So some of that work is the sort of policy work that I described, right? So the legal enforcement guidance that I described on race-based discrimination based on hair. Some of that work comes into play in the law enforcement context. So we are a file-by-right agency, which means that folks can come to us when they experience discrimination, and we have attorneys who will investigate those reports, and then who will also litigate them before the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings. But we also have the authority to do commission-initiated investigations, right? So to see something that is happening in the world and to take action based on that. So one of the things I would point you to is a recent case in which we negotiated a conciliation with a large-scale property manager, right? That had a blanket rule of not allowing folks who, or not accepting tenants who had any conviction or arrest history, right? And as folks here know, that is a policy that prior iterations of HUD have identified. as having a disparate impact on Black and Latinx folks, right, who are more often targeted by law enforcement. So in that case, we got $55,000 for emotional distress damages for the individual in question, $25,000 in civil penalties. The property management company was required to contact folks who had previously applied for housing and to let them know of their actual eligibility. Was required to change its tenant selection policies, and was required to train its employees on protections under the city human rights law. So it's a mix of things that come in that are happening on the policy side, but also on the law enforcement side. But there's a lot more to do. I'll see that.
Hi. In terms of, I guess, the facial recognition we're now seeing with a lot of the video cameras and kind of some of the steps that have been seen in California, has New York City, I guess, considered taking similar steps with, like, I guess, the public cameras or and maybe what security cameras private institutions can put in? And then what kind of, I guess, what things are you considering to kind of keep up with this continual change in technology so that we don't have similar situations where we make a great technological leap, but then we have all this kind of discrimination on the back end?
Yeah. So at this stage, the kind of primary mechanism that the city has for trying to think through how it's going to approach its own use of algorithms or automated decision systems, as legislation calls it, is the task force that I co-chair, right? So it convened starting in spring of 2018, and its report and recommendations are going to be issued at the end of November of this year. And really the questions that that council charged us with developing recommendations around are precisely the ones that you've flagged there, right? So how can the city identify when a system is having a disproportionate impact on folks on the basis of their membership in a protected category like race or gender or age? How can individuals who are impacted by decisions made by automated decision systems get information about those decisions and explanations of them? What information should be made public broadly about these systems? So we're not at the stage where I can share publicly about where the task force has landed, but you should continue to watch because that stuff will be out soon. And I'm happy to talk about this with folks as well.
So I have a question that kind of follows on that. I'm always thinking about human rights commissions and how they're nested within government, which raises the question of, like, so what is the rest of the government doing if they're not supporting human rights? Like, do you have some counter office of utilitarian value neutral balancing that you have to consult with? And I think you do, actually. But I wonder if you could talk just a little more about the sort of threshold question of what is the mandate of the Human Rights Commission? What sorts of rights are you looking at? I assume it's not Second Amendment rights, for example,
No,
but how do you
you're right.
distinguish
yeah.
that?
I'm happy to drill down on that a little bit.
And
So-
sorry, and before you answer
Yeah.
that, I just want to say that, well, answer that, then I'll say one more thing.
Okay. So our city human rights law applies in the areas of housing, employment, public accommodations, and then discriminatory harassment. And then kind of sprinkled across those areas, we have about 25 different areas of protection. So they range from protections that you'll see in other state and federal statutes. So, the protections on the basis of race, gender, age, sexual orientation, others. But they also include some that you won't see other places or that you see in very few other places. So in the housing context, we have protections for individuals who, on the basis of lawful source of income. So if you're someone who uses a voucher in order to pay for housing, you're not supposed to be discriminated against on that basis. We have protections for folks who are survivors of domestic violence or stalking. We have, and that's both in the housing context and the employment context. We have protections on the basis of, like I said, criminal and conviction history, credit history and employment. We have protections on the basis of one's status as a caregiver in the employment context. we have a new protection around, that prevents employers from asking about an individual's salary history when, during the initial stages of the hiring process. So, actually, yeah. So it's quite a bit, and it has grown, I think, as, I think folks' expectations about the kind of protections that they're entitled to at work or in the places where they live have grown and changed. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say, while people are still here, because I know a lot of people have to leave at 1, that you've been really generous in being present during this week, and we want students to feel not shy or reticent about reaching out to you through the Rappaport Center or directly. If you have any interest in these subjects, we're really committed to getting students to engage with this work, doing research, or even if it's just having a friendly conversation about career choices. So I just wanted to make that clear to students in the room, and I think we might have time for 1 or 2 more questions anyway.
More than happy to talk to folks about career stuff. Over here and then over there.
You said that housing was the first area that, well, it was the first one you mentioned that you work on. I was just curious, is all the work in housing done through legal avenues and lawsuits, or is there like an organizing component, or do you work with tenants unions?
That's a really interesting question. Historically, when the commission was much larger in the 90s, there was an actual tenants organizing project at the commission with staff folks who would actually go out and work with tenant groups, but also do some organizing of their own. We don't do as much of that work now, largely because of our size, but we do do a lot of kind of training around fair housing, and that's both of folks in community-based organizations and tenant organizations, and then also of folks in the real estate industry so they understand what their obligations are. Over here.
My voice is pretty loud. First of all, welcome. I am a transplanted New Yorker.
Oh, I love it.
I have a question with respect that goes back to your staffing issue. First question is, do you have an office in every borough?
We do. We have community service centers that are located in each borough. The Manhattan Center is co-located with the central office, so it's in Lower Manhattan, but the others are kind of centrally located in the other boroughs.
So my other question is, what is your relationship with legal aid attorneys as well as pro bono counsel?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So folks can come to the commission even if they are not represented, but we do have a number of folks who come to us and are represented in their cases by attorneys from legal aid, which I think works to their benefit as well as to the commission's benefit. We also partner with legal services organizations around like outreach programming. So, that's often, we will do things like a Know Your Rights session and also have like a, for lack of a better term, a mobile intake